Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Well, welcome everybody. We'll call this informational meeting for Tuesday, October 1st to order. Welcome to October. How'd that happen? All right, everybody's slowly filing in here. I think maybe what we'll do is do the audit committee report first, if we could. Councilor Neitzer, did you want to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really good audit committee meeting yesterday. We had one audit report presented, which was the purchasing card program performed by Abby Vandelinati, which is going to be presented soon at an informational meeting to the full city council, and then it will be a report at a city council meeting. We also talked about some administrative issues, and that included the 2019 audit plan status. That's moving along nicely. Most of them will be completed by the end of the year. There's one that really needs to change in scope and be larger, so it'll get bumped to the next year likely. The administrative items included talking about the audit survey and the results of that, which was really asking stakeholders what their feelings were of how the audit reports and the audit presentations look, and what value they get out of them. And we've already have some changes based on those, such as we have kind of an executive summary page that was really well received. That kind of has a one-page report of the important things to take away. Discussion about how we do management contracts, the cycle that we do those. Discussion about doing more consulting audits, which is getting best practices and recommendations and helping the administration implement some of those recommendations that are made, rather than just kind of giving them an audit and giving them the results and then walking away. The audit engagement process, which includes exactly how each audit will go, the timelines and the steps, and making that more formalized, and then also things like training, and then also a fraud control policy update that was adopted in 2012, and that's going to be brought to the city council eventually, likely for with some amendments, and then also a discussion of the launch of the new fraud hotline. So a lot of good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor. And Councilor Brecky, could you maybe give us a rundown of the CVB bid board last meeting? Thank you.
Morning. And I will just start with the financial report. We had a financial report, and they had really hunkered down early in the year, because things didn't look so well, and they got into some budget cuts, and now actually things are looking very well. They're up by $95,000, and so the direction given to staff at this meeting was to just look at the possibility of reprogramming some of those things they cut out, should that trend continue. They still have to wait for 3 months to know exactly where they're going to end up, for the year. But it just took a dramatic turnaround, and so they're in a really good place at the moment. And then the marketing report, they're on pace to hit the goals for this year, and there's various details, assorted details that kind of postured them for that, but I think that's the basic thing, that they're hitting their marketing goals. They're working on a new app to energize the craft breweries in town. There's 12 locations now in town that are craft breweries, and they're looking on, there's some technical legal issues associated with applying incentives to drinking alcohol. So they're working through that, but they're hoping to come up with just a special app that you can pay for a membership to, that kind of encourages people to become involved and to visit those businesses. So that's kind of a fun thing. And they're also working very diligently right now on a new website, which they hope to launch in 2020. Continued work on their strategic plan. There's some pretty big changes ahead. This strategic planning process was very thorough. Really looking at how they're branding themselves, looking at deep dive into the organizational structure itself, and really thinking outside the box, in terms of their future, kind of taking a big futuristic view. So they're still getting the results from that, and kind of setting the direction. The sales activity, there's a list of events, but basically year to date, they've had $33 million of impact, as a result of the activities. This last month, there were 50 events totaling 185,000 attendees. That was since our last meeting. And then if you remember when Terry was here, she talked about, she was really excited about an article that was published in the St. Louis Journal that they just paid to have this guest come, and they wrote this really great 2-page article. I'll be getting a copy of that via email, which I will forward to all of you, but the Chicago Tribune just picked up that article. So we've got this great 2-page article that at the end of the day, it cost us $250 by bringing this person into town and showing him Sioux Falls that fell in love with us, wrote this article, and now it's, got over a couple million views. So pretty excited about that. And again, year to date, she has a list of how she compares us, of other venues. And at the current moment, Milwaukee's number 1, Rochester's number 2, and Sioux Falls is actually number 3 amongst a list of about 20 of our peers. So things going well with the CVB.
Awesome. Thanks for that thorough report. We will move on to City Council open discussion. Anybody? Councilor Staley?
I would just like to put out another invitation to the public and to my colleagues to attend the Neighborhood Summit. It's going to be this Saturday from 8 to noon at the Ann Zabel Theater at the Orpheum. It's free, but they do want you to register. And anyone interested in Community Neighborhood Watch Association activities should attend this and perhaps think about reinforcing the one they already have or starting a new one. So just wanted to put a shout out for that.
Has there been an agenda posted for that yet?
There is, yes.
There is. Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on to presentations. Councilors Brecky and Staley with the beekeeping ordinance.
Thank you, fellow council members. My pleasure today to present to you what I think is going to be a positive experience and a positive ordinance. It's an urban beekeeping ordinance. And the first question I would ask, because I've been asked it, is why a beekeeping ordinance? Does the city really need an urban beekeeping ordinance? And it's not just about bees, I would answer, but it's also about butterflies. It's about bees and butterflies and a little bit of a bigger picture that we're working on. But the really longer answer to the question is it's really more about bees and butterflies. It's more about a topic of conversation that needs to be a constant and ongoing conversation that the city needs to continue to have, particularly the city council and the mayor's office, and that is the issue of sustainability. I mean, in larger cities, and we experienced it out in Los Angeles, they have an entire division, an entire system of buildings that's dedicated to sustainability. In those areas of the country where you're heavily populated, one of the things you learn in the area of sustainability is that, when more people collect together, you can have more of an impact if you decide to do something. And when you're dealing with those global issues, cities become a vehicle for creating change and getting things done. So I do see this as a very small step, and I hope a positive step, something that we can all wrap ourselves around together on as in the council in this urban beekeeping ordinance, because one of the things that may be the segue eventually to bigger discussions, things about air quality, water quality, environmentally sound practices, best practices, global warming, all those issues come under the heading of sustainability. This is just a small step in that direction, and that's why I got excited about it, why I grabbed hold of it, and why I wanted to begin those discussions in a place where I thought I could generate some interest and support from the council. One other thing to understand is that from a global perspective, the bee and butterfly population is diminishing at a rapid rate, and that they are a very important part of the world's ecosystem, bees and butterflies. And so to do a small step, to take a small step, to do something positive in that regard, I think is worthwhile and worthy of our attention. The proposed ordinance, it does not seek to correct a problem like we've like we don't have enough bees. And in fact, one of the things I learned is that in South Dakota, fun fact for you that I just enjoy sharing, is that, in fact, we have a lot of bees in South Dakota. Our governor's kind of recognized that, but one of the things we learned is that there are a couple of large businessmen who have who keep bees all over the state, and that they transport them in semi-trailers to California every year. These millions of bees are transported to California to pollinate all of the almonds. So whenever you eat an almond, every single almond needs to be pollinated by a bee. So think about that. The chance that when you're eating California almonds, it's probably about 90% that they were pollinated by bees here in South Dakota. So again, it's just another kind of thing about our rural industry, something fun to be aware of, but it is something that is happening in our state, and so I think it's something that could and should be allowed to happen in our city on a limited basis. When I learn, and I've got more information, I've got Tim here who's going to be presenting to you after I'm finished. First of all, Teresa's going to show us a few slides too, but just then a little bit about the specific ordinance. As I dove into it and became educated and learned more about and understanding about bees, and again, learn more about how we're capitalizing on them throughout the state in this rural area that we live. What I was focused on was really three things. I was focused that the ordinance have an education component. I learned in my own education process that it's not a simple thing. It's not something anybody can and should do, that there's a fairly legitimate expenditure involved. For someone to get in this, it's probably going to cost between $1,200 and $1,500 to get involved in something like this. And it became apparent that it shouldn't be available to someone who's just going to kind of randomly decided one weekend over a beer, gee, I think I want to get into bees. It really needs an educational component. And so that was one of the things that you'll find in the ordinance itself, that there's required that they take and be certified, having taken a class that's recognized as an acceptable class, by our Animal Control Division, which, by the city. The ordinance says city, but the Animal Control Division will be the one that will be supervising this. We've been working hand in glove with them all through this process, to make sure that we have, again, I wanted something where there was an education piece, where there was a liability piece, and then the cost piece is just already built into it. And those were the things I was looking for in order to put something in place that would encourage people to do this. Because again, we're not solving any problem. It's not like there's a problem out there that there isn't one. It's just something we want to encourage in those few places, and likely there won't be hundreds of these. It's more likely that based on the study from other cities, that there might be 5 to 10, 12 at the top end, people who actually do it and actually have the good locations to do it. Think of places like Old Orchard Heights, some of the larger acreages, some of the places like my own neighborhood where we border a drainage ditch. There probably are a handful of places in this city, and if that interest in knowledge and education is there and the liability issue is taken care of, that they could establish these honeybee colonies and reap the rewards of having the honey. And again, we'll talk about the bees themselves. I'll leave that to Tim. But the cities that we looked at in doing this, we looked at Stillwater, Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Rapid City, South Dakota. None of them had any problems with it once they passed the ordinance. And quite frankly, our ordinance is a cut and paste job. We look primarily at their ordinances, and I don't know if I sent them to, I think I did an email. If you want them, you can certainly look at them. And we kind of put those components together. But then I added some things that, again, came with my own education, which was, again, having that education piece, that certification in that class. One of the big safety issues is the flyaway. You have this barrier thing that you put up that makes the bees go up. And they go in up to a 3-mile area to pollinate every day. So when you put this flyaway thing, it becomes very critical from that whole safety liability standpoint. That makes them go up. And when they go up, then they go over, and then, you know, they have this natural a tendency to go far away, you know, and then come back, you know, each night to the hive. And then there's a waiver of liability. They have to name the city as an extra insured in order to, you know, get this permit. And that was, again, the extra liability protection. And then the neighborhood involvement piece. We did require 100% of agreement by abutting property owners, and then an 80% agreement to property owners that are further, you know, kind of a little circle further out. And I got to thank Greg Neitzer for that. I was struggling with whether it should be 80 or 100, you know, and then he came up with the idea to kind of make it both, kind of two levels out. So I appreciate that feedback on that, because I was kind of struggling with the right way to approach that. But again, don't see a lot of these, but happening. But I do think there are certainly places in town where they could happen, and it would be nice if they did. Then just a final note on the kinds of bees, and again, I'm going to turn it over to Marty. It's Tim, right?
Tim.
Tim, I got the wrong name there. Over to Tim on a little bee education. One of the fun things that I learned in the process is, you know, all the different kinds of bees. And I would emphasize that, again, the cities that have engaged in this practice, there's just virtually little or no problems has it caused if it's done right. And we have worked with the animal control to make sure that we can shut down a bad operation, that we can, you know, monitor, you know, operations, you know, just, you know, by, you know, just checking on them annually, that sort of thing, to ensure that it's not going to cause any problem. But one of the things we did learn along the way is there are different kinds of bees, and honeybees should not be confused with wasps and yellow jackets. I call them their cousins, who are naughtier. And honeybees are, I've learned, a very docile bee by nature. They seldom or rarely sting, and putting these hives in this handful of places that they'll be throughout the city, the likelihood of anybody getting stung is probably no greater than just someone getting stung by a bee in the wild. There are other bees, which I'm looking forward to Tim speaking to you about, and he's got his visual aids here, which are really fun, that people might be interested in and encouraging, and they're called pollinator bees. They don't produce honey, and they don't even have the ability to sting, because they don't even carry a venom. But if people have apple trees and they'd like to encourage the bee activity, we looked at that, whether that needed any regulation, and decided it did not need regulation. It did need encouragement. It's something we should encourage. I think from an educational piece, and just, it's kind of, I would describe it's kind of like putting up a martin house. If you want martins to come in your yard, you put up this house, you maintain it a certain way, you clean it out, and they'll come, and it's fun. He will be talking to you about these two different kind of bees, mason jar bees and leaf bees, that could be encouraged as part of this. We decided it did not need any regulation. And again, I'd use the analogy, it was more like a martin house. It's just something if you wanted to do, it might be very fun and easy to do. And we wanted to encourage that as part of that. And just then a final word on the butterflies. Again, this is part of a little bigger picture. We have been working with the Parks Department on both the bees and butterfly of issue. Just conceptually, is there any parks like Sertoma Park, Arrowhead Park, where the city might engage, you know, the practice of you know, maintaining hives, or whether we might allow someone to be licensed to come in and do that. We identified 5 different parks where that might be possible. And then they did agree to do 2 things. They already were on top of the concept of planting certain flowers that attract the monarchs and make them come down. Again, the monarch population worldwide is diminishing rapidly. They migrate, you know, across the country, across North America, and there's not as many of them, and they're dying out. And so it's the idea that we could attract them down. What a beautiful thing, even if it's in a small way. So encouraging people to plant these certain flowers, and you know, in our own Parks Department, to let the wild areas grow the milkweed and the kinds of things that draw them down. You know, what a wonderful thing. And so our Parks Department has agreed, like in Terrace and McKinnon and Tut Hill where we plant lots of flowers. They were already cognizant of it, but they're going to try to plant more of the kinds of flowers that attract the monarchs. And then they're going to add something to the brochure that they give out on the boulevard gardening that is going to explain to people and encourage, just a paragraph that will encourage people to, consider planting these kinds of flowers that attract the butterflies. That's all I've got. Teresa's going to do some visual aids because she has butterflies and bees in her yard. And so I'm going to do that just to stimulate a little excitement and discussion, and then we'll have Tim, and then I can come back up for questions if you have any questions.
Thank you, Counselor.
One final thing. As you'll note, it's still in draft form. Again, considering this a work in progress, gave it to you guys early, got some feedback, but if after the discussion period you still have more feedback or more concerns, wanted to leave it open-ended so that we could address those before first reading.
Thank you, Councilor Brecky. This issue surfaced several months ago when the Argus Leader ran a report in the newspaper about bee classes being offered in Sioux Falls, while at the same time there was no legislation allowing people to keep a bee hive in the city. And after I saw that, and someone might have tagged me, I don't know how my attention was drawn to that, but I shared that story on Facebook, and I was just surprised and blown away by the amount of interest there was in this whole issue. And I will say in the last several months, Councilor Brecky and I have been to different groups and been speaking about this, and every time we bring it up, there seems to be this resounding support from the community for keeping bees in Sioux Falls. And I think there's even a broader base of support, as Councilor Brecky said, for just helping the environment and working for the beneficial ecosystem to keep the insects and butterflies coming. After that initial Argus article, I brought the city staff, the legal department, and the health department together, or was it was legal, and then animal control came in, and then some citizens came in and a few councilors to have a working session to discuss potential litigation or legislation to avoid litigation. Legislation to make this a doable thing for our community. I want to say many thanks to our employee over here, Jim David, because as we all know on the council, this guy does the research. And he's the one who reached out to these municipalities who have bee ordinances in place and got all the information that we could bring together and have as this discussion. The reason I'm up here, well, I partnered with Brecky to do this, and she's brought her legal expertise into the whole ordinance wording, which I appreciate. But there are already bees in our community, and their bees are all over my yard. I wanted to show a few of my favorite, and the bee and butterfly favorite flowers. This is called a Zebrina hollyhock, and the bees like to get right into the center of this thing and do their thing. You can go to the next one. There's one right there. I got the deeper purple and the lighter purple. And I suspect they probably like hollyhocks as well. Go ahead. This is Queen Anne's lace. And Tim, you can probably identify these things. Of course, that's not a honeybee, but do you know what kind of? Yeah, that's some kind of a bee. It looks like there's 3 different kinds of things going on over there. Go ahead. This is Margaret Straley. And every year, Margaret and her cohort travel into my yard with their butterfly net, and she's part of the University of Kansas at Lawrence's program on tagging butterflies. So you see that little tag there. I think there's another picture of her. Yeah, so they catch these monarchs, and she was in my yard the last 2 weeks, and there were very few monarchs, and ironically yesterday, there they were, all over the place, gobs of monarchs. So they must have been waylaid someplace on their travels up north. And that's the little netting. This is bee balm. Again, bee balm, Monarda. Bees love it. Aptly named. Yep, thank you. Here's some goldenrod, and those are some other kind of less identifiable bees, but they're right there. Zinnias, I save the seeds. You see that little ribbon around there. I tie a little piece of yarn around the best seeds, and I save them every year, and I've been able to cultivate very strong-stemmed, vibrant plants. But these are a favorite of butterflies, human beings, and bees. Here's something called a garlic chive. Again, you see that little bee in there. This is a phlox. Butterfly liked that. These are tall asters. I've got pink purples. They're blooming right now. You see the bee right in the center. Yesterday, the monarchs were just going crazy over these things. There's a zinnia, some kind of bee. Another one of the asters. A sedum. Sedum is a very common plant. Bees love it. Butterflies. Butterflies. Bee in the center of the plant there. And here's a combination of the garlic chives and the sedum, all very popular. There's another, go ahead, Jim, goldenrod, asters. And so just if you want to put that summary of the different plants. So, and we had this wonderful conversation with the park department, and they, as Janet Brecky said, they're really looking at planting more of these things and encouraging citizens to put these in their yards. Sedum, goldenrod, phlox, those zinnias, which are an annual, the tall asters, garlic chives, Queen Anne's lace, Sabrina hollyhocks, Mexican sunflower. I didn't get those planted this year, unfortunately. They get an orange flower. Oh, they're fabulous. Obedient plant, ironweed, tall ironweed. It's a purple plant, fabulous perennial. Joe Pye weed and bee balm are some of the plants that really attract these things in my yard. And I know that other people have other things that are beneficial. So it's a great conversation. And this is something we can do, whether this ordinance would go anywhere or not. People can do this kind of a thing to encourage the bee activity. And I am allergic to bees, and I never get stung, and I'm working around them all the time. So I think it's a good thing. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce Tim Olson. Tim came on board. We know Tim from Mayor Huther's Neighborhood Summit. Tim and his associates did a presentation several years ago. I think it might have been like 2014. He was one of the presenters talking about green earth things. And so he reached out in the midst of this initial bee working session we did, and he is the expert from Northwestern Iowa Beekeepers Association. Doesn't keep any bees in Sioux Falls, but he teaches classes here. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Counselor. Yes, welcome, Tim.
Let's see how smart you really are. So, why do bees buzz? They don't know the words. Oh, come on. So tell me the beehive's favorite singer. Sting. I was going to say the Bee Gees. Well, favorite musical group is the Bee Gees. I could drone on for a long time. Yes. In my day job, I'm executive director of Groundworks in South Dakota Ag in a Classroom, headquartered here in Sioux Falls. We have a presence in 102 school districts in the state, and we hope to be in 150 in 3 years. My hobby is beekeeping, and my wife will say that I'm a beekeeping geek. This is from about 3 years ago. This is kind of a beekeeper's dream, this big tower. We have not had a beekeeping year like this in 3 years. But this hive had close to 400 pounds of honey in it. It takes 2 million flowers to produce 1 pound of honey. It represents 23,000 foraging trips by bees to produce 1 pound of honey. If you look at this tower, you look at 400 pounds of honey. It's a lot of flowers, a lot of foraging trips, and a lot of bees. In this colony, you'll find 3 castor bees. You'll find The drones, who are the playboys of the hive, all they do to exist is to mate. In the fall, they get kicked out because they don't produce anything, and all they do is eat. So the worker bees, who are all female, get rid of all the drones. And sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Yeah, get rid of all the guys. And of course, there is one queen. And for those who always ask the question, how do you get the queens come in the mail. So I will buy queens from all over the country, looking at certain bloodlines, certain characteristics, and they come in a flat box. I get a call from my postmaster saying, come and get your bees. And they come in these little cages with the queen and several attendants that take care of the queen. For us beekeepers, this is a picture of beauty. This is healthy brood pattern. What that represents is there's a cell, and every cell you see here has a larva that's growing. Worker larva will emerge in 21 days. Drone will emerge in 24 days, and the queens in 16 days. But we want these healthy brood because we want to see this happening. Worker bees. Worker bees are the workhorses. They're all female. They live only for 6 to 7 months, or 6, 7 weeks, I should say, in the summertime. The bees that you see out flying are actually at the end of their life cycle. They're forage bees for about 2 weeks, and then eventually they just don't come back. Bees are clean. They do not defecate in their hives. In fact, in the wintertime, they do not defecate at all until what's called a cleansing flight. We get those nice warm days in January. That's when they come out and they defecate. So we don't see any defecation in the colony, so there's no problem with any manure or any smells you might have with other types of critters. Someone asked me about colony collapse. This is the real culprit with colony collapse. It's called varroa mite. It came to this country in mid-1980s. It is a terrible parasite that carries various viruses, and that's what's really killing our bees. So my job as a beekeeper is not just to manage the bees, but to manage the varroa mite through monitoring the population, through wise treatments, and to maintain so that these bees can come through the winter. Because typically when bees die in the winter, it's because of viruses caused by the varroa mite, and also because something else. People will say that, do I keep my bees outside? I do, because cold does not kill bees. It's cold and wet. This winter, if this was a living colony, it could be 40 below zero out here, but within this box will be a cluster of bees. In the middle of that cluster is the queen. That cluster, in the middle of that cluster, it's 90 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. So bees really have 2 cycles. They have a summer bees and winter bees. Winter bees are able to dislodge their flight muscles and through vibration maintain heat. What happens is the queens in the middle, the bees on the inside work their way to the outside, outside bees to the inside. So for us in this part of the country, bees do not die because of cold, they die for other reasons. But varroa mite is our #1 culprit. One of the things that can happen is swarming. Swarming is a reproductive stage of bees. We as beekeepers try to manage so this doesn't happen. If a colony does swarm, we lose a good portion, about 50% of the forage bees, so our honey yield goes down. So my objective is to try to prevent this from happening. It happens sometimes nonetheless. Typically swarms are very docile. They are in a kind of a psychological place where their bellies are full of honey and they're looking for a new home. And in the middle of that is the queen. And so they're fairly easy to handle, fairly easy to remove with very little chance for stinging. It does happen. I did have a conversation with Dr. Julie DeYoung that I am very willing to come and assist as needed if this happens and other problems in the colonies do happen. As was alluded to before also is there some other possibilities for bees. It depends upon the citizens' goals. If they want to produce honey, if they want to deal with actually managing the animal, then the honeybee is the way to go. if what they're looking for is pollination, there's some other bees that are probably better choices and should be encouraged. Those are the solitary bees. Primarily for managed solitary bees are the mason bee, which are active early in the season. When temperatures get to that 40 degrees, they're the ones that typically will pollinate fruit trees. And then midsummer, the leafcutter bee, which begins to emerge around 70, 75 degrees. The reason they're called a leafcutter bee is they actually will cut oval shapes into leaves. They will carry that leaf then to the holes you see in this wood block. Within that leaf, they will lay an egg plus the feed for that larva to develop. So from the standpoint of bees, they're remarkable creatures. They're just remarkable creatures. I've raised a lot of animals in my day, and bees have the stiffest and steepest learning curve. Every time you think you've got them figured out, they change the rules. They don't read the same textbooks I do. They don't read the same manuals or magazines I do. They don't watch the same YouTube videos I do. They're constantly changing the rules. So that's one of the challenges, maybe one of the blessings of beekeeping. It's really an intellectual challenge, how to manage the bee and so on. One of the things that I would encourage is I do teach beekeeping classes. We do a 10-hour course. And I say my first goal is to talk people out of it. Because beekeeping requires management. It's really a livestock enterprise. It is an enterprise that requires constant monitoring, constant watching, and taking care of problems when they need to be taken care of. Not everyone has the discipline or desire to do that. So that's where maybe, you go back to the solitary bees, may be a better option for them. So are there any questions on the bees themselves? So the equipment, primarily, this is a beehive. This is called 2 deeps. In the summer months, typically colonies will have between 30 to 50,000 worker bees.
Turn the box around.
Sure.
I think people at home would have a better look at, not the actual, on top. Yeah, just turn it the other way and then.
Okay.
That way it's picked up.
All right, all right.
We got it.
So are you still presenting? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, for wrap up, then I'll open it for questions, but if you got more, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I guess just the standpoint is, I think this offers some really unique opportunities for families. We hope to be in one of the program areas is Groundworks. We do school teaching gardens. We hope to get some of these solitary bee houses into those gardens. We have a demonstration garden at the Mary Jo Wagner Arboretum, and we'll be adding some of the bee demonstrations as part of our demonstration there as well. So that's a quick overview of bees a little bit. So what are the questions you might have about beekeeping or some of the concerns about beekeeping?
Very interesting stuff. Councilor Neitzer.
Well, thank you. This is very informative because this is one thing I know very little about. Well, let's just go to Final Jeopardy. The big question that people would have is if somebody has bees next door, what is the realistic concern that they're going to swarm me and I'm going to be stung and that, because I mean, honestly, that if I hear anybody who's already having a concern about it, it's that they're going to be stung.
The person who primarily gets stung is the beekeeper. So I'm the one, as a beekeeper, I'm going to get stung probably a higher percentage than anyone else. Especially with the ordinance talks about the 6-foot flyway. So you place that. So here's the front entrance of the bee colony. You place that so the bees fly up and over. So they're flying over the top of where most of us are walking. Bees are not aggressive from the standpoint they're not going to intentionally try to sting anyone. If a person gets stung, they might run into them, and so it's a defensive type of impulse. You're more likely to get stung by wasp and hornets. In fact, bees get blamed for stinging from wasp and hornets. But if a beekeeper has been well trained and they manage their colony, there should be a minimum of stinging to anyone who's not the beekeeper themselves.
Okay, thank you. And then, so just help me, like, just basically wasps and hornets as opposed to just the honeybee. What's the difference?
Well, part of it, they're in different genus, but part of it is just the stinging apparatus. The honeybee stinger has barbs on it. If it came and stung me, The barbs would stick in my skin, the bee would walk away, and literally its guts would stay with the stinger. So that bee that stings is committing suicide in protecting perhaps the colony. Wasps and hornets have smooth stingers, so they're able to sting multiple times. So from the standpoint, if I'm a honeybee, if I sting you, I'm giving my all. Wasps and hornets have a smooth stinger, and so they're able to sting multiple times. Does that help?
Yeah, that absolutely helps. And this may be a question also for sponsors. So if somebody's keeping it for honey, is it something where people are packaging and selling it, or are they just making the honey for themselves?
That's a good question. I don't know what the rules are. Most honey, within this ordinance, you're not going to have a lot of extra honey to sell. Most beekeepers give it away. It's Christmas gifts. It's all sorts of things. But the whole issue of sale would be something that I can't respond to.
Okay, I'll ask sponsors about that when we finish with questions for you. I will defer while I look to see if I have other questions.
Councilor Erickson.
Talk to me a little bit about the transferring of bees. So say I have this hive in my backyard, the boxes, I don't know the right words, so bear with me here. But if I need to add and bring in more bees because I didn't maybe manage, or the mite got in there and took some of it, talk to me about the transfer process with adding more bees.
Well, if I'm going to start beekeeping, there are two ways, or adding bees, there's two ways you do that. There is something called packaged bees. It's a rectangular cage with a queen and about 10,000 bees. And there's a process that comes enclosed. There's a whole procedure one follows to introduce those bees into the bee box. Now that particular package has no comb, it has no way of surviving until it gets into the colony. There's something else called a nuke, or nuclear hive. That is a miniature version. Typically, in here are what's called frames. It's called Langstroth hive. The principle was created by a preacher back in the 1860s. We still use that. So this is called a frame. In the nuclear colony, this is an 8 frame, there's 10 frame. Most nukes are 4 to 5. They're basically miniature versions of this colony, and they're carrying on functions. That would be transferred in. So what you do is, let's say you had 8 frames, and you had a 5 frame nuke. You would take out 5 center frames. You would take the frames of bees that are in the nuke and place them into the colony box.
So talk to me about how dangerous that is, or if it's not.
It really isn't dangerous. The bees are disorientated. Typically,
If done properly, I'm assuming.
Pardon me?
If it's done properly, I'm assuming that there's no issues with it.
people don't typically get stung if they do it. I mean, the package, those bees are very disoriented, they're confused, very little stinging, if any, takes place. I don't know if anybody, I've never been stung at that time. When transferring the packages and nukes, I've yet to be stung by those bees.
Okay. And the reason why I ask that is of course, you always find that one story of something happening bad and where a swarm of bees killed a dog and attacked all these people, and it was here in South Dakota. And so I don't know.
Sensational television does that for you.
Well, and I don't know what went wrong with that, but it seems like if you're teaching the class and you're teaching you how to do it, you know.
You're more likely to get bit by a dog than you are stung by bees. That's going to
In
harm
this
you.
case, the bees. In this case, though, the dog died.
Well, and what is your part of what you see and wherever this took place is
Sturgis.
probably in the south.
Sturgis, South Dakota.
Really? Interesting.
And because of that, they changed their ordinance, and their ordinance that they've changed it to appears to be really similar to what this ordinance is being introduced.
Part of that is when we do our training, when people are buying those first bees, we suggest they come out of California rather than the south. Because of our short growing season, we can't have those bees are not available. So if we're going to start and get those bees end of April, first part of May, they have to come from a warm climate.
Okay.
Sometimes bees coming out of the south have the influence of Africanized genetics, or Africanized bees. they can't survive in our winter.
Right.
But at the same time, if you're putting one of those that has those genetics that's within that colony, you could have that response. So we are strongly proponents of bringing the bees out of California where the Africanized bee does not exist.
Right.
So part of it's being a wise consumer. And again, as we do the education, we talk about where to get bees, how to get bees, and so on.
And I know it's an isolated incident, but it was here in South Dakota. That's why I bring it up, that it just, what's that process for transferring it? How many bees fit in a hive, a box?
Well, typically what we try to talk about is in this part of the country, we want 2 brood boxes, maybe up to 3, so there's enough winter storage, winter surplus honey to get that colony through the winter. In a mature colony, in the peak summer months, you have between 30 to 50,000 bees. The queen is laying about 1,500 to 2,000 eggs every day. So there's constant emerging of new bees, and there's also bees that are not coming back because they've died.
Right. So give me an example of, I know on here, it's restricted that, it says there must be no more than 2 colonies of bees for every 2,000 square feet of property area with no more than 4 colonies on any one property. So say a person has 4 colonies, times 40,000, 30,000 per colony would be about what a neighbor could have.
Well, I mean, you could do the mathematics. The biggest thing that probably is the biggest limiting factor is the density and the competition within that. Bees fly about 3 miles looking for forage. They can go further, but it's typically 2 to 3 miles. And part of that's going to be dependent upon what the forage is available in that 2 to 3 mile area. If I have 4 colonies, there may be too much competition. For example, even though my bees are out in a rural area, I have 6 bee yards with no more than 4 colonies per bee yard. Because I found in my own experience, I had too many bees in a bee yard, and when I reduced the numbers, the density, the yield per colony increased. So part of this is going to be limited, first of all, by the available forage in the area. Secondly, is the cost.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The hobby is not cheap. And my wife, we've been at this for 10 years, and my wife keeps asking when we're going to make some money on this thing. So
It's a hobby.
it's a hobby.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And then I have a couple questions for the sponsors, but my last one for you is based on several emails I've received. And again, I'm not a bee fanatic. I don't understand everything with this. So if my questions are silly, I apologize. But that there's going to be bees everywhere in my neighborhood. And all of a sudden, each neighbor is just going to be swarmed with bees, and there's going to be bees everywhere. And I don't want to diminish those concerns that people have, because it's very real to them, especially if you have a kiddo that has an allergy to something like that. So how do you respond to, how many bees will someone see in the area? Even if we say, hey, six foot fence, they're going to fly up and come back and whatever. Will you realistically, you may not even know your neighbor has, other than signing the paperwork, you might not even know your neighbor has this colony. Would that be a fair assessment or no?
Let me answer it this way. The person asked me, they say, Tim, I noticed some bees in my yard. Are they your bees? And I say, will you check the ear tag on them?
Yeah.
You don't know.
Right.
You don't know where those bees come from. If they're seeking forage, remember, they have a flight of 2 to 3 miles away. They're going to go where the forage is high quality and fits whatever needs they have at the time. So even if I'm a neighbor here and I have colonies in my yard, the bees that are in the next yard may not even come from my colony.
Right.
You have no way of identifying that. The other question is, as we looked at the slides, there were several different species of bees. So part of it is it the honeybee we're talking about, or is it some of the solitary bees that really it's good to see that many bees?
And this ordinance only addresses honeybees.
That's right. That's right.
So if somebody wants to have the other box that you should,
Yeah, the other one, the solitary bees, this one is they're very gentle. They're very, it's an easy box to take care of, easy bees. You're not likely to get stung with bees, especially for the person who just wants pollination.
like
To me, that would be a good option. Because the honeybees, which I love, it's a livestock enterprise. But you don't have some of the same issues of odor, handling waste and so on you have with other.
Good, thank you. You're clearly very educated on it, and I appreciate it. I may reach out to you with more questions I have.
That's fine.
Any other questions for Tim? Counselor Staley?
Just a clarification that when we started this conversation, 3 things that were very important. First of all, and that's why I'm grateful we actually had people involved with this bee enterprise. But the first component is education, and that's in this ordinance, that people you can't just go out and get a hold of some bees and throw them in a hive in your backyard. This is going to mandate that there is an educational requirement to even step into this. Secondly, registration, so that the city is going to be able to keep track of where these hives are, so that Councilor Erickson might address some of your concerns about having too much of a congestion of too many hives within a certain block, that the city is going to be moderating that. And then the last thing is we got the registration, then we got regulations. So we're really trying to, you have to be registered to do this. We're trying to kind of micromanage it for the safety of the citizens to make this happen. And the other thing that I did talk to the officials from Rapid City we were in Pier last year after this discussion happened. I talked with the mayor and the chief of police, and I said, you've had this thing happening. What's been the occurrence of problems? They said 0. There's been no, and I think theirs is a little more lax than ours is out in Rapid. So, and I do believe like the Mall of America even had some bees on the rooftop. There was something going on there. So have you hear about like citywide, inner city beehives that happen?
I mean, right now, the whole urban beekeeping thing is a movement in a lot of places. New York City has bees. I mean, there's a lot of big metropolitan areas that do have bees. Because really, for a beekeeping perspective, actually, it's a better place to have bees than the rural areas right now, because there's more forage within the city limits than is in some of our agricultural areas, which are pretty devoid of good bee forage.
And lastly, the flyaway zone was another thing that we have that in there, but you've got to, you don't just have a hive out in the open. You've got to have that up. Get them, if they go off the ground and fly away, what is it, 6 feet? Then they're off the ground. But if you don't have that, Tim, then they would kind of hang at the ground level, right?
In urban environment, you need that barrier to push those bees into that 6 foot or higher flyway.
Councilor Neitzer.
Okay.
So is each individual colony represented by some number of stacked boxes? Is that
That's correct. So
fair
this
to
would
say?
this would be one colony.
Okay. So in a normal 2,000 square foot lot, I could have 2 stacked
You'd have to-
stacks, 2. Okay. And the class, is there some sort of an organ? I mean, it sounds like you do it, that the city could count on, that somebody, is there like an organization or something that certifies this?
And I would answer that too. That's something that I talked in detail with the animal control. We didn't want to put a specific class, but we put total discretionary authority in the city, which will be again administered by the animal control to determine the appropriateness of the class. So it has to be a class that is approved by animal control, because there's colleges where they can take classes. Tim does classes, so we wanted there to be, and that they have to have had the class within 1 year of having set up the hive. So you can't just take the class and then 5 years set it up. So that was how we tried to address that.
Okay.
And then your earlier question was about the selling of it. If you'll look in the ordinance, we did require compliance with South Dakota law, state law. And that section, those sections really are all those state laws that are in place, which really are driven towards that commercial requirements, those requirements to sell it. And so this is really more, more designed, again, for the hobby beekeeper.
The hobby, okay. And do we know if for lack of a better term, that the ones that stay in the small box there, do we know if that's legal in Sioux Falls right now?
That was what I was referring to when I said, you know, we took a look at, does this need further regulation? So when Tim came in, we had a second meeting with him to explain these, and we just kind of learned about them through this process. And because we talked to him about, you know, do we need to regulate this? And we could come up with no reason that this needed regulation. That's when I was talking about, it's kind of like keeping a Martin house. You would just have the joy of watching them crawl in and out and pollinate. They don't have stingers and they don't have venom. And so it would be, you know, and again, you know, to use Jim David as an example, he's got apple trees. And he thought, geez, you know, there's a website you can go to, and it's really easy to keep it clean. And they just, you know, they just generate and die and go in and out of it. And again, it's kind of like, if you think of it like a birdhouse, we could think of no reason that it needed any regulation. If you guys disagree with that, we can certainly take a look at it, but that's where we rested on that issue.
So from a number standpoint, you'll have about 50 to 100 mason bees or leafcutter bees associated with the smaller house.
Okay.
Honeybees, which will have tens of thousands.
And to be clear, there's no prohibition. You can put that one in your yard or right now. Okay, all right. That's what that it didn't need to be.
And again, they don't generate any product like honey, just pollination.
Okay.
Just increases the bee population, thus increasing the pollinating.
Okay, and so another sort of beginner question. So this has to be 10 feet away from a property line, it says in here. So it sounds like the colonies would have to be from a property line. And so I just want to envision, as an example, you've got one of these 10 feet away from the property line, and then there must be a barrier. So maybe they have, like, let's say a 6-foot fence or something like that that would qualify as the barrier. I guess 2 questions. That 6-foot flyaway, where does the 6-foot measure from? From the top of the box going up, or off the ground, or how does that work?
Off the ground. What you're doing is, again, those bees are coming out, and then they're having to fly up to a 6-foot height. So they're going to come out in different places. If you notice, there's multiple entrances here.
Okay.
So those bees will be coming and entering at different levels on the box. So the barrier itself is 6 foot from ground to top.
And if I could further answer that question, that also was a discussion point, whether to actually require that it be in a fenced-in yard kind of thing. But we decided not to because of the language you just said. It allows us to require it if it's necessary, but we contemplated, again, places like Old Orchard Heights where there was just enough natural space that a barrier wouldn't be required. But I would think of, you know, for smaller opportunities, there would be a lot of people would just naturally, you know, have a barrier, but we didn't make it an actual requirement because we could contemplate multiple situations where the natural landscape would take care of the closeness and proximity to neighbors, and it wouldn't be necessary.
Okay, and it does go into detail of what a flyaway barrier can be, and it can be multiple things: a wall, fence, dense vegetation, so probably shrubberies and things like that. Maybe the other question that I maybe had was, let's see if I can find it here. Keeping class.
I'll go to Councilor Sale. Did you have a question? And we'll go back to Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just one question. Where does South Dakota rate as honey production in the country?
Either 1 or 2 next to North Dakota.
Thank you.
Really? Wow.
Did you find it?
Okay, yeah, okay, so the last question I think I maybe had was, and this is again kind of addressing maybe fears and misconceptions that maybe people have. So let's try this. So you have a colony 10 feet away from the property line, and then maybe there's a 6-foot fence or something like that. On the other side is a family, and they maybe have kids playing in the backyard. The kids are hooping it up or whatever. Do the kids really notice anything going on? Do the bees care about what's going on across the fence? I mean, you know, that interplay?
In the middle of their action, they really don't care. The only time, again, that you're going to have any potential danger is if folks are too close to the box inside. When those forage bees are out collecting nectar and pollen, they are focused. And that's what they do. They're not out trying to protect, because again, it's all about survival of the colony. That's why they exist. And so any protection by those bees is going to take place at the site of the colony primarily, and not away from the colony.
Okay, and then the last thing I suppose is like just trying to visualize, so are they leaving throughout the day to go pollinate, just kind of, you know, or is it like at 7 in the morning, 30,000 bees, just kind of?
Typically, of course, time of the year. For example, out in rural areas, I have to deal with spray. And so I deal with commercial spray, particularly planes. So by law, they cannot spray within 1 mile of a bee colony after 8 o'clock in the morning and before 6 o'clock at night. So typically the bees are active because bees are also cold-blooded. Right now, if I went to look at my bees, they would be in a very loose cluster. At 50 degrees, they go into loose cluster. So they're going to come out and fly probably in that 60 degrees approximately, and they're going to fly when the sun is shining. And then by 6 o'clock or just before dusk, they begin to come back to the colony. So they're moving back and forth during that entire time. On a rainy day, they don't fly.
Okay,
So,
very good,
Any
thank you.
questions for Tim? Counselor Stanley?
Say, one person did, and Tim, you might not know the answer to this, but someone raised the question, would the mosquito spraying we do in Sioux Falls harm?
what time of day do they do that?
Well, they came by my house 2 times last night. I hope they didn't hurt the monarchs, but that was, I'm
at
going to
night?
say like, 10 o'clock?
So, I mean, if you look at all of the native bees that were on your flowers,
Yes.
those bees are already hunkered down someplace. So that's why the spray that takes place at 10 o'clock at night is not apt, because those bees are not flying.
So that spray is aimed at anything in the air, you're saying? It wouldn't seep through the holes
Because
of,
typically, those bees are going to have direct contact with that in order to bring it back into the colony. So if it's done in the middle of the night, those bees are not flying, and the chance of exposure is minimal.
do you know where the butterflies are during the night? Where do they go?
You know, they're probably hunkered down in some trees, some shrubs, that kind of thing. But from the standpoint of the honeybee, you're not likely to have any death loss because of mosquito control.
I had a couple questions for you, but a couple counselors hit those already. I guess my other question, maybe you touched on this, as far as these classes go, is there a cost or different?
Yeah, there is a cost. Our Sioux Falls classes are at the Arboretum, and we charge $100 per individual, and then we give a discount on family. But that includes 10 hours of instruction, and there's meals and all that included. So we usually walk away with not making any money, but there's cost. The other thing we believe in, if a person's going to make a commitment to be a beekeeper, the cost of a class is the minimal part of the total expenses of beekeeping.
Right.
And so often I hear beekeepers who have not taken a class in training, and it's a disaster. So
Yeah, I just thought I'd make it clear
for
if
$100,
anybody's out there
it's a well
watching what
spent.
what they were looking at, if they were gonna look into it, so. Well, thank you, appreciate that part. Do we have any more questions for the sponsors while we're still talking? Counselor Erickson?
I just, my one question is I don't see like 1,000 people come racing forward to get an application for this. So in your research and in your conversations, what are you expecting? And I'm not holding it to you. I'm just curious if you're like, oh, we think maybe 10 people at first, or, I mean, what are we talking about here?
Fair question. Again, the cities that we looked at, like I believe Rapid City had 5. And so I thought, twice the size of Rapid City, 5, 10 at the most. I mean, again, this isn't, it's a small piece.
That makes sense. And then one more question, just because it's come up so many times, and I heard you mention the liability component. Will you talk just about liability component and what your conversations were and how the general population can feel safe with this, with whatever you put in with the liability component to it?
Yeah, the main things that we looked at, again, was the education piece. And I think Tim just reemphasized that at the very end here, We thought, that just became clear to me that needed to be a requirement. And again, we put the discretion in the city to certify which classes were appropriate so that it was good education and that we've talked about how they would implement that, and they're going to have to fill out a form, and then it's going to have to be signed that they actually sat through the whole class. You know, they didn't just put their name on it and then not show up. And so there's, so there's going to be, a legitimate education component, again, so they know what they're getting into. And then, again, the cost is part of the issue. I mean, it's going to prohibit a lot of people from doing it because, it's not cheap. I think it's between $1,200 and $1,500, to get into it, plus the class. Then from the safety issue, that flyover, as you heard, was very important that we require that flyover piece to happen for the urban beekeeping. There's a liability waiver in which a person in getting this permit has to file, again, with the city, an additional liability waiver that names the city as an additional insured. So, that person will have to have insurance for their hobby, and the city will be named as an insured under their policy. And then what I would call the neighborhood component for the abutting property owner, there has to be 100% of approval if their property abuts the person who's seeking the permit. And then for an additional, can't remember how many yards out we went, I call like the second circle, they have to have 80% of approval, from those further out from the initial abutting property. So those kinds of things are going to limit the places that it can be. And then with the education requirements, it's going to, set it up so that there's protection from the liability standpoint and then from the knowledge standpoint, and then just the natural costs. So yeah, again, it's not going to involve a lot of people, but for those who are interested in doing it, it's going to provide that opportunity and that encouragement.
Any other questions?
If I could say one more thing, this is a draft, so we're open to any feedback that you think would make this more palatable or anything that, we brainstormed and sat through lots of meetings with lots of different city officials, and so open to anything that you may have that would help.
Okay. Councilor Neitzer.
My one last question, I think, for sponsors, and just to clarify, it talks about in location of hives 9102, which is section A, hive placement. It says, all hives shall be placed appropriately on the lot so as to inhibit access to the hive from adjacent properties and to prevent interference with the movements of persons on adjacent properties or in the public right-of-way. Now that says inhibit access to the hive from adjacent properties, so that must leave some interpretation, I suppose, maybe during the permitting process, so they can look at it and see if what's there is acceptable. I would assume that would mean that they would want to see something like it's in the backyard and there's a fence or there's some shrubs where somebody just walking down the street just can't walk up to the hive very easily, but it leaves them some latitude for them to make that decision one by one.
You're exactly right. The way that discussion went was we didn't want to say it had to be in the backyard because, again, in some properties, maybe, like, again, I keep using Old Orchard Heights, there's places, or these larger estates, there's places where it might be in the corner in the front, but it's, far away from everything. So we really wanted to leave that more up to the discretion of what's going to be animal control officials to work with the property owner, put it in the best place.
Okay.
And again, with the eye towards the concern that Christine raised, so that the kids aren't just wandering too close to the hive. You want to get it in that more obscure place on the property.
Okay, that's all I have, thanks.
Anybody else? My question, the one I have, okay, so if a colony is found to be a nuisance, the hobby beekeeper must relocate or destroy all hives within 30 days. Who determines if it's a nuisance? Who makes that judgment?
We worked hand in glove with both animal control and the city attorney's office. So we had Keith Allenstein was involved in our meetings, and that was actually put in there specifically for him because he wanted to have clear authority to be able to deal with a situation should you have someone who got into it and then, just like negligence with animals, just all of a sudden lost interest and then had a danger there. And so basically legal has approved that language as being suitable for them to go in and actually just stop it, just take over, just haul it out of there if they wanted.
Okay. Gotcha.
Or order, they'd start with, I think you actually talked about starting, or like everything else, ordering that they stop or ordering they clean it up themselves and doing all those things first, and then if there wasn't a positive response to the orders, they'd follow up with final action and take care of it themselves.
Okay. Thank you. All right, well, that was very interesting. I think we all learned something there. If we are all done, we will move on.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, we have to do public
Oh,
comment.
sorry.
I'm sorry, did you have a comment?
Nope.
Question? Are you sure?
Jumping the gun.
Okay. Public input on our subject today, anybody? Oh, come on up.
My name is Boyd McPeak, and I just wanted to relay my experiences with bees and native plants. A few years ago, I started putting native plants in my yard, and about 4 years ago, I tore out one of the boulevards and planted native plants. And this year, it would be the third year, I have a real nice, diverse prairie, micro prairie in this one boulevard. And earlier you saw the picture of the goldenrod just covered with bees, and I had some goldenrod in this prairie I have. And I counted 5 or 6 kinds of bees. I'm not an expert, but you know, I counted different kinds of bees. I know there were some blue mason bees in there and other bees. And there were just tons of bumblebees as well. And they're so busy pollinating that, you know, I wasn't worried about getting stung. And and as it was brought out, many of the native bees don't even have stingers. So the one thing that I thought was important was that any flower will attract pollinators, but you need the native plants to provide habitat, just like the monarch butterfly only lays its eggs on milkweed plants. Some native insects are the same. They need specific plants to lay their eggs on, and they also overwinter in the stems of plants. So it's important to have native plants to provide the habitat for the native pollinators, which will do a lot of pollinating. And so it's been my experience that if you build it, they will come, because you know, I put in these native plants, and it's just loaded with pollinators now. And the other thing about this is that these native plants in the boulevard also act as a buffer strip, which I know the city has a policy on, because the deep roots of these native plants will loosen the soil, and it will absorb a lot of runoff. So to me, it's a win-win. Earlier this summer, I gave a little talk at my yard. People were interested in it, so I just invited them over, and I had about 24 people show up, and to see the native plants that I had. And at least several of them are interested in doing this. So I think it's a good time for this resolution on honeybees, and also to promote native plants and native pollinators. A couple specific things are on the city's website, where it talks about the boulevard ordinance. It lists alternatives to turf grass, and one of them it lists is native plants. I'd like to see more information. People don't know what native plants are. I'd like to see more information on what native plants are, where you can get them, and how to plant them, how to take care of them. So I think this is a good start, and I just wanted to share those comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to enter executive session for the purpose of consulting with legal counsel or reviewing communications from legal counsel about proposed or pending litigation or contractual matters pursuant to SDCL 1-25-2, parent 3.
Second, Nitzert.
Okay. Have a roll call vote, please.
Council members Brecky,
Yes.
Erickson,
Yes.
Nitzert,
Yes.
Selberg,
Yes.
Sale,
Yes.
Starr, Staley.
Yes.
All right, we will move into executive session. If everybody could vacate the premises, thank you.